call the roll, please?
Certainly, Nikki Austin is present, Rich Debris.
Present.
Eric Ekdahl.
Present.
Terry Ellefson.
Present.
Teresa Keen. Present. Cheryl is not. Dylan
Here.
McGuire. Phil Vosberg.
Present.
And Tim? Is Tim not here? No. Okay.
All right, we have a quorum, we are in session. I would entertain a motion to approve our agenda for this evening.
So moved. Second.
A motion by Teresa and a second by Nikki. By voice vote, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, nay. Motion carries. Next, we have our consent agenda. Does any board member wish to remove an individual item from the consent agenda for consideration? Hearing none, we'll read them into the record. We're approving the minutes for the Board of Education July 11, 2022 meeting. Approval of support staff hiring, Tricia Pernot, Northside Educational Assistant, Brooke Schmidt, Parkside Educational Assistant, Angela McKay, Middle School Educational Assistant. Approval and acceptance of community donations. Jacob Swag Foundation, $1,000 to the MHS Link Crew. Jacob Swag Foundation, $500 to the MHS Junior Optimists Prom for Pennies dressing rooms. Jacob Swag Foundation, $5,000 to support the Sources of Strength District training. And one more, Jacob Swag Foundation, $1,000 to the middle school web program. And can't thank Jacob Swag Foundation, and Terry, and your board on the tremendous support that you give to the district. Always doing something to support mental health of our students is really important. We really appreciate it. With that, I would entertain a motion.
So moved.
I'll second.
I think I heard Eric for the motion and Teresa for the second. By voice vote, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, nay. Motion carries. Next item is public comment. I don't have anybody signed up for public comment. No old business, new business. We're on to our first item. So this is informational. It's a review of the exempt compensation study update. This is a second visit to us from Jenna. She's got some more information based on the feedback from the board from the first visit that she came here. So you're here to deliver the final presentation. And if we have any questions about it, we'll direct those to you during the presentation. And then we have a closed session at the end of the meeting that the board will discuss compensation. So hold compensation specific questions to the end. Go ahead.
Thank you so much.
There we go. Thank you. Thank you again for having me back. We were here back in March and shared an update on the compensation study with some conversation and direction from the board. We're bringing back some final recommendations for consideration. So it's been a couple of months. We'll do a quick review of those policy discussions that we had previously had. We'll share with you the final grade order list, which, as you remember, was our internal review to kind of stack the hierarchy, if you will. I've got two different structure options for consideration, so I'll share both of those with you, talk to you a little bit about kind of the pay philosophy differences between the two, and then end it with some final recommendations, things to consider as you move forward. So as I mentioned, we had previously discussed really 4 key policy points through a process like this. So the first one is defining who that target market is. A lot of talks right now about the pay markets, what's the market paying, all of those types of statements are being made. First thing you need to do is define what that market is. So I'll share with you in just a minute here the sources that we had utilized for it. Once we've defined what that market is, the second policy decision then is where in that market did you want to compete? So we had talked about the median or the 50th percentile. Some organizations choose to lead, some choose to lag. So that was that second decision point. The third one then was around the structure design. And so this is where I'm bringing forth 2 different options for you to consider, 2 different design choices. And then the fourth one being around a development of an implementation plan. So how do you go from where you are today to that final structure that you decide upon? As I mentioned, bringing forward our final recommendations on that grade order list. So again, this is kind of that internal view, the hierarchy. And as a reminder, these were established utilizing job documentation, review of that, utilizing our point factor job evaluation system. So going to the first policy item, that target market, up on the board as a reminder of the different data sources that we ended up utilizing. So there's 6 different data sources. And ultimately, based upon the feedback that we had back in March, what we ended up doing was weighing all of the K-12 data at 100%, so that custom data source that we utilized for the administrator roles, and then we did a 50-50 blend, so really trying to take into consideration some of the cross-industry where you're competing for talent and roles even outside of K-12. So that was the target market development and the data sources utilized for this project. Policy item number 2, again, was, okay, we've measured that market, we brought forth the measurement of the 50th percentile, and ultimately it was decided that that's the target. That's where you guys would like to set kind of your policy. When we did do the measurement of that 50th percentile, overall we were sitting at 95%, so just a little bit behind that target market. But ultimately utilizing the 50th percentile as our structure development moving forward. Policy number 3 here, again, thinking back on the type of structure. So at the time, we were talking about different plan design, and the board had identified the hybrid plan. So you'll see in just a minute here, again, that's the steps at the beginning portion of the plan, kind of some structure to get people up to that midpoint or that kind of anchor relationship to the median market. And then it's an open pay plan beyond that. So that's where some of that performance element could come into play as well. That was the desire by the board in terms of the feedback that I had received at the time. In going back and reflecting on some of the comments I had heard and some of the past practices, truthfully, of the district, I've also created an open range system. The reason for that is historically, the past pay practices have very much been related to this flexibility to identify increases based upon the individual, kind of the circumstances, and not so rigorous in terms of the step element. So that's the rationale for why we've created 2 different options, and I'll show you both of those here in just a moment. So this is that first option. This is that hybrid model. So what we've done is, from a competitive perspective, the control point, or that 100%, is that anchor to the market. So that's an approximation of that 50th percentile. And then the 90% on the far left would be 90% of that control point. So that's the minimum of your structure. One way to think about this, or how we tend to see these numbers align, is about 10% below the 50th percentile when you're measuring the market, is a good approximation of the 25th percentile. So we've set your structure up in a way that it's competitive on the 25th percentile at that minimum, step 1, and as you move towards your control point, you're aligning to that target of the median market, the 50th percentile. So that's where you see those 2% increments of those steps. So the idea is, if you brought somebody in, you'd start them approximately step 1 or step 2 of the minimum, and then with each year, they would progress on those steps, kind of that defined movement until they got to the control point. And then beyond that control point is where you begin to have more of that flexibility around increases and amounts, okay? So as things are right now, I recognize increases had occurred for 2022-23 school year, but as they're right now, the cost to implement this step structure, placing people onto the step that provides an increase. So if we go back here for just a minute, if we have somebody today in grade 16 earning $38.50 an hour, they would simply be placed on step 2 of that grade. So it's just to put them onto the structure, getting them onto a step. Okay. So the cost to do so is just under $23,000. And what you see here in this box around the comp analysis just demonstrates for you the steps in which people would be placed. So you have about 40% who would be in that performance zone, or that open range beyond the control point, and the remaining 60% would be placed onto those steps. Okay. Again, going back to kind of the historical practice, more of that individualized approach to compensation, I did want to create this open range structure. Again, just thinking about the intentionality of those steps and the rigidness that sometimes comes with those steps. The one advantage is it's a commitment to getting people to that control point in an appropriate amount of time. Okay, so that is a benefit of the hybrid plan that doesn't exist within the open range system. However, if you're used to providing increases in this way and you make that effort to have similar type movement towards that control point over 5 to 7 years, then an open range system can work for you as well. So in this model, the minimums and the maximums are identical to the hybrid plan. They're still sitting at 90% for the minimum and up to 120% on the maximums. So again, the key difference between the two is just that flexibility on a year-to-year basis and how you provide increases. The biggest concern around open range models for many public sector organizations is, are we going to move people through the structures in an appropriate amount of time? That's the biggest concern around that. So again, if we can look at some of the past practices, and do we have kind of a plan in place for moving people through, an open range system can work for an organization. So in thinking about the implementation cost or strategy here for option 2, it is cheaper because you're not trying to place individuals onto a particular step. So in this case, the cost of implementation for that open range drops to $14,000. We're simply trying to get people into the pay range. So bringing people up into the minimum. Again, with the individuals who fall within that 90 to 120% within those pay ranges that are established, their overall comp ratio is 101%. So what we mean by that is, how does their individual pay compare to that control point or that anchor to the market? And you're sitting in a competitive stance with that coming in at 101%. Okay.
You said the control point, just
Yeah.
the 50% median.
Yes, the control point is that anchor to the market. So it's not an exact, but it is a relationship to that market, right? Yes. So final recommendations here. Realize you're not making a decision now. You are having discussions later today. Really identifying which of those two structures is most appropriate for you moving forward. Recommend the grade order list as it was presented, and then choosing either of those two structure options to move forward with. Depending on the timing of the structure, you may need to do something to it. And so what I mean by that is, right now the structure is identified and priced for this school year. If you choose to hold it and implement it with the 2023 school year, or fiscal year, I should say, July 1 of next year, you'd want to age that structure forward. Okay, so the exact amount you'd be aging it forward, my recommendation is hold on that. If you do decide an implementation for next July, let's reconnect. We can have conversations early part of next year to get a better sense economically what's happening in the marketplace, to give that better assessment of how quickly do we need to age that structure forward. Okay, so just something to note with that. The reason you're doing that aging of your structure is to keep pace with your target market. Okay, so some things on here, I'm gonna jump to the bottom for just a minute, thinking about pay system maintenance. So on an annual basis, this conversation about what should we age our structure by should be occurring, right? So the idea is the structure itself is linked to the 50th percentile, and the markets continuously move. So adjusting your structure on that annual basis will ensure you continue to keep in that competitive space, okay? The other recommendation then is on a 2 to 3 year schedule, put a big asterisk on that, dependent upon the economics of things right now. Go ahead and remeasure the market, right? So that's the interim adjustments that you're making on an annual basis will ensure that when you do go to remeasure the market in that 2 to 3 year window, that you've made progress against it. It's much easier to make incremental changes to that on an annual basis than to wait 3 years, remeasure the market, and look that you need to do a significant 8% adjustment or something greater. So That's the kind of system maintenance piece to be aware of. Again, I say preface it on economics, right? So traditionally, 2 to 3 years is sufficient. Right now, there's a feeling that things are slowing down, so that could push that out a little bit. But the reality is for the last year, we've been doing every 2-year adjustments just because the market has been moving so quickly. So just something to be cognizant of in kind of planning for forward adjustments. The other piece around system maintenance that I want to mention, we've got the grade order list. As jobs are evolving or if there's significant changes to roles, they encourage to continue to have those jobs reevaluated to be placed internally within that structure appropriately. So that's something we can continue to help the district with on an ad hoc basis, should that be needed. The last piece then is in there in bullet number 3, just thinking about kind of future philosophy. So we don't have this situation occurring today, but within the structured design and as you're utilizing your system moving forward, how do we want to utilize, how do we want the maximums of the pay system to be implemented or utilized? So things can occur over time. We may have incidences where individuals increases, send them over the maximum. Is that something that the district is comfortable with? Do we want to have some sort of policy in place to say we're going to utilize those maximums so the max of that pay grade is the maximum pay rate that we would issue? Other things to consider is if you have somebody over the maximum, you can freeze their pay, keep them where they are until the pay range catches up to them. Again, understanding you're moving it on an annual basis, or providing lump sum increases. So instead of those increases being added to their base and continuing to build on that problem, you could provide one-time payments and it would slow kind of that misalignment to the range. So again, not something that needs to be decided today, but something to keep in mind and to be thinking about moving forward. Any questions about either recommendation, either schedule or these final recommendations?
You talk about pay system maintenance, and we talk about a regular interval where we go to check the market again, and then in between that interval, we would be making annual adjustments to the pay ranges. Does it make more sense, or is it more flexible to have the open range? Because if you know, CPI is 9%, and we've made an adjustment to a pay scale that's got steps in it, we've automatically committed to those pay increases. So I think my experience with this is you're adjusting ranges each year, you're adjusting ranges annually, but the pay increases are separated from that. So if your control point has moved and you've dragged all the steps with it, automatically the folks in those steps get a pay increase. So you're by definition saying every time I review this annually, I'm giving everybody a pay raise, and we have to, Ron wants to make sure that we don't run out of money, and I do too. And I think having a little bit of flexibility there, we want people to definitely stay within their pay ranges, but is that one of the rationales for the open range? So when we do these annual adjustments, we're not automatically pushing people out of the steps that they were supposed to be in.
Yeah, you bring up a really great point. So I'm going to pull up that step structure for just a minute. So this is one of the complicating factors of step systems, is when you do age the system forward, individuals on steps are going to get that aged amount. And then oftentimes you're also providing that step increase, right? So there's 2 different pay factors that's really happening there. I think it's important to note that when you are aging your system forward and somebody is on a step and they're receiving that adjustment, they're simply keeping pace with the market. And then that step allocation is their traction internally. So to continue to move towards that midpoint. So although steps complicate it by providing kind of both elements, it is a recommended component, right? And so when we're thinking about, to your question, are there 2 different pieces happening? There absolutely are. And so when we look at measuring and getting a sense of what's happening from a salary planning perspective, we actually look for 2 different measurements. So we say, what are you adjusting structures by? And so that would be that indicator of how we're gonna age the system forward. And then what's your total annual payroll budget increase? Which gets to then that separation of, are we allocating steps? Are we providing additional money towards performance, whatever that might be? So yes, to your long answer to your question, sorry, is there is definitely more flexibility in that open range system for that annual maintenance as well.
Okay. So the reality of school finance will restrain the annual increases that we can do. So while we should try to make some progress there, so that we're not trying to adjust as large of a range over 3 years, it sounds like we could still go with either plan, but we're pricing out that plan each year with each one of these raises
Yes.
to determine what's affordable, right?
And so typically what will happen for most school districts that have a step system in place, we think about, you know, the CPI or what that adjustment amount was. They'll look at, okay, so how much is it gonna cost us to adjust the steps to provide those step increases? And then what can we afford kind of as that leftover to age the system forward? So in and of itself, the structure starts to lag the market because we're not applying that full amount to the steps. But our employees are still moving and making that traction. So there are ways to manage it with the step plans.
Questions, comments, board or administration?
Yeah, I think those are good questions, Rich, because I think that does become the balancing act when we don't have, sufficient revenues to pay for the thing, for the increases. And so, part of the board's goal with the compensation study was to get people to those midpoints and onto the market. And, I think what Jenna was alluding to is if you don't have the steps in place, maybe we sometimes aren't getting the people up to the market. On the flip side, if we have the open range and we apply it to, or even if we do have steps and we apply it all toward the steps, and then we don't move the whole structure at the rate that the rest of the market is growing, then the whole structure falls behind. So it's the reality is, we need better school financing, right? We've known that for 20-some years, but it becomes difficult to get to where the market is when, as I think Jenna said earlier in the presentation, we're close to the midpoint, but we're at about 95% of the midpoint. We've got a number of people who just need to get up to there, and so when you're already playing from behind, it's tough. If you were playing from ahead, then you could make that work a little easier.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I this is the challenge, right? When we measure the market and you come back and say, okay, the median is where we want to target. That 50th percentile is where we want to be. And we come back and go, okay, there's a little bit of a gap from where you are right now. It's going to require a different way or additional dollars to get people up that you haven't spent historically, right? Because if we had spent them previously, we wouldn't be 95% of that median market. So it's going to always cost a little bit more if that is indeed our target. There's a couple of different ways that you can kind of look at making moves towards closing that gap with the two different implementation strategies as well.
And I will say that, to the board's credit, it was good to see that we really only had 3 positions that, were lagging the minimum of the market and that we really need to do that catch up on. And the rest of the positions are somewhere in the spectrum and most are pretty close to the midpoint of that, so.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jen. All right, next item. This is second review of the 22-23 elementary parent-student handbooks. Initial review was at the last meeting. Does anyone have any comments, questions about those handbooks for the elementary schools only? Hearing none, I'd entertain a motion if somebody would like to make it.
Second.
Okay. I've got a motion by Terry and a second by Eric to approve the 22-23 elementary parent-student handbooks as presented. Any additional discussion or questions? Hearing none by voice vote, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, nay. Motion carries. Next item is discussion on the middle school and high school proposed grading change that would have an impact on the parent-student handbooks. So I'm going to turn this over to administration to present.
Okay, so I'm just to get us started, and then I'm gonna let Todd take over, and we'll hear from our principals if there's questions. During the administrative retreat, as we were talking about data and moving the PLC models forward, it became apparent that there were some structures in place that may actually be slowing us down that we can address. And Jeremy and Brian both shared different aspects of the way the current system is that are definitely creating a hindrance for some kids to engage probably at the level we expect them to engage. So what we're gonna talk about are some things that we can do in the immediate that can address some of the deficiencies. It's not a silver bullet, it's not a be-all, end-all. It's a great place to start, and it's going to align with our mission to improve instruction and student engagement. So I'll turn this over to Todd.
So like Fig said, I think as we get deeper into our PLC work, we want to make sure all of our systems, our policies, our guidelines align with that work. And, at the retreat, we discussed, grading and assessment. Although it had been discussed frequently in the past, I know Jeremy and I have had several conversations this year alone about some of those barriers, some of the things the students, teachers are dealing with at the classroom level that really don't align with what we need to be doing within our PLC work that supports student achievement. And really when we start to look at how do we use information that we collect from students, so formative assessments that really guide the process of us gathering feedback on student learning, but then giving students feedback on where they're at in that process. So when we start to look at some of the components that are part of their grading assessment guidelines, specifically the 80-20, summative versus formative, and then what type of requirements do we have in place for completion rates regarding formative, we feel like there's some changes that we need to make in those areas that would better support our PLC work and better support that culture of learning that we're trying to foster within this. So Jeremy, Brian, you guys want to discuss maybe just some specifics?
Sure. You all have heard it before too, and some of you have students at the high school or have had students at high school. So this won't come as a surprise, but one of the major complaints from some of our teachers is that a good portion of the students, when they're given some type of work, will say, is this formative or is this summative? And what it means is, and see Nikki shaking her head, she's got a daughter in my daughter's grade, and my daughter asked me this too, because formative work is only worth 20%, and kids are like, I'm not gonna do that. And they'll only do the summatives, and that's a bigger portion than you would think. And it's really stuck out to me this year as we've gotten further into the PLC work and defining what our learning targets are and what our power standards are. And the teachers have really done a lot of work kind of narrowing their focus and their work to align to those things. And so we started going through these data analysis protocols, which is the teaching and learning cycle. So basically, here's our identified target, we taught this, then we assess it, and then we intervene based on a number of kids that got it or didn't get it. But going through that, we go kid by kid, and when there's a large portion or even a third of the kids, which it is up to a third of the kids, that didn't do any of the formative work, we have no idea of knowing did they learn it or did they not. So how do you place a new intervention in place? And it was really, really hindering that process. And to the teachers, they're like, we've been telling you this forever, so yes. Another thing is when kids get to take a summative, since we have retakes in place, which are not a bad thing, I'm not saying that at all, but with no constraints on it, some of the kids would literally say, I'm not studying for it, it's okay, I'm just gonna go in there and I can just retake it. That's not any type of educational structure that you want. So it's becoming more apparent that that's a barrier to the work that we're doing. I mean, if I equate it to, if there's a number of kids just grubbing for just enough points to pass and get the credit, whereas we feel like we want them to achieve at a higher level, have higher rigor, then we need to put some things in place so that we ensure that they get to that higher rigor, rather than let them do the lowest amount of work to get the credit, to get by. And then, to me, common sense says, it's no wonder they're not performing on some of those state assessments, right? They're doing the minimal to get by and not at a rigorous level. So that's one of the things that I've been talking with Todd about and Fig about recently about, are there some things that we can put in place to make that a little bit better and easier for our teachers? Not that we want to radically change things, but what was put in place, I don't even know how long ago it was, 10, 12 years ago now, was well-intentioned and well-researched, and Thomas Gusky and all the big authors out there around this stuff was good. I don't know what we did or didn't do to roll it out, but it is manifested in not the same way. And we're seeing quite a bit of apathy around the work needed to get done to gain those skills. Not from all students, but from a bigger portion than you would think. And as Fig said, it's not a silver bullet. We're still gonna have students that say, I'm not doing that. But maybe we can grab a bunch of the students right now that are like, it's not too important to me, I can still pass by passing the summatives, but maybe they could pass at a higher level when they're doing that extra work and working a little bit harder.
Everything Jeremy said. PLCs are predicated on getting students to practice the skills that you've identified as the most important and most tied to your power standards. And so the 80-20 summative formative split disincentivizes practice, right? Students will immediately ask, is this a summative? No, it's formative. Okay, so 20%. I don't know if I really want to put. And it's especially true for students that need the practice the most. And so I would just add that piece. Jeremy, you said it, but
No, I
you said
totally
it
agree.
quite
Yeah,
well.
the
So,
struggling learners are the ones this hurts the most.
and he's correct. It's not, you're not going to fix everything by changing the grading policy, but if you have a policy that's not convergent with your PLC aims and goals, that's challenging.
So, we have a meeting with our grading and assessment committee for next week that will discuss some of the pieces that are in our policy currently that we may need to address. Like Jeremy said, nothing radical, but certainly we want to make some adjustments to start moving some of these things forward that align with our PLC work. So that committee will meet and discuss and give feedback. And then the plan would be to come back to you guys before we approve a handbook with any of those changes, so it can be part of the approval.
Yeah, when we say nothing radical, I mean, I think I'd ask every one of you, I know every one of you, and say, do we want our students to do the work that's assigned to them? Yeah, I mean, I think we all do. We want them to do that work, right? I mean, that's what we're talking about. Make sure they do that work so that they practice the skills and so that we know and can give them feedback and then can intervene if they don't get it. I mean, they're two different problems. If we give it our best effort, they give it their best effort, and they still don't get it, then we can deal with that problem. If we give it our best effort and we have no idea how they got it, I don't know how to solve that problem.
I'd just add, I think the work we've done with our narrowing the focus of learning targets, power standards, our teachers are going to be more intentional about what those formatives are, that they align and support our work within those power standards and learning targets. And we do have pockets of teachers that have done some of that work last year with some success, that when they really focused on all right, kids, here's what you need to learn, and you're going to practice, and we're going to give you multiple times to practice, but this is the end game. I think we saw a little bit of success there.
So we have a duo of teachers at the high school in math, geometry, I believe it was.
Yep.
That did a pilot with us where they said, we're not gonna let you fail, but these are the things you must learn. And you're not gonna move on from this class until you do learn them. And they had some students that retook different assessments, measuring that skill up to 7 to 8 times. But they kept coming back. For them, it flipped the kid's mindset. Just saying you must do this in order to pass the class, because these are the skills we know that you need to be successful moving on from here. And the kids didn't balk at it, they actually rose up to the cause. And the key to that was not just all on the kids, it was the two instructors too saying, I'm not gonna let you fail. We'll go back to the drawing board, but now you're showing me what you don't know, so let's try it again.
Okay, so, question time?
What's that?
Question time?
Sure.
Okay, all right. So you were saying that You're seeing 1/3 of the students not complete the formative work.
And a guesstimate for me, I'm gonna pull a line from it, but yeah, there's a large number of students, and not just the students who are really at risk, who you expect from that. I'm talking even my daughter. Who's saying, it's not super important, it's only a formative. It's like saying that to me, which I made her do, but, you know, so there's a lot of kids thinking that way.
I mean, it's intuitive to think that way. What I just want to make sure that we're doing is we're identifying, because we should have the data, identifying the specific students that chose not to do the formative work, if it's 1/3 of our students, and then identifying the corollary to their poor performance on the summatives. Have we done that?
Well, I don't think we have that data to do that.
We don't have the data to do it, or?
You can't, the Skywar's not that robust to take out individual work completion rates
Okay,
compared to their summative performance that I'm aware of.
okay.
There might be a couple other factors in the grading policy that are impacting the data. The nobody getting less than a 50 on a summative assessment is also going to negatively impact the accuracy of the data. So, you know, if somebody doesn't learn through the formative or doesn't have any formative work to be evaluated or retaught, and they take an assessment and they get a 15, the lowest score they get is a 50. So some of the data isn't gonna be reflective actually of what's been learned or taught. And that's one of the other areas that has to be discussed.
Okay. Specific to this change, I just want to make sure that we understand what the success criteria are from the change, what we're baselining, and then determining the success criteria are to ensure that there's a corollary. And I get it, it's intuitive. If we think if the kids aren't doing the work, then they're probably not going to perform as well on the summative. But I want to make sure that when we're making changes like this specifically for student achievement, that we're saying, this is where we think we need to improve. This is how we're going to make the change. This is how we're going to measure it. And this is when we're going to come back and reassess to see if it was successful. So that's kind of, I'm okay with you guys making the change. I just want to make sure that the framework is there that will give us a baseline, understand the corollary from where we want to go to the measured success, and then know when administration will come back and present again and say, it worked well, awesome. Also, okay, it didn't work, and this is how we're going to adjust. So understand that, at least from my point of view, if you want to make changes to increase student achievement, I think you should have the ability to do that in any way you see fit. But we need the feedback about whether or not it was successful or not, and it's okay for it not to be successful as long as we react quickly and are honest about that.
So ironically or not ironically, that is the PLC process. So, and we did have that discussion today also about the baseline data that we're gonna use. And that's when a few more things came to light that would have to be looked at. So, you know, we thought we could look at, you know, earned grades and credits earned, graduation rate. But like I said, some of that data we're gonna get is gonna be skewed because they never got an assessment score under 50%. So that's gonna.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I think you can look at, you know, the grade point average and grades, and I think, you know, we don't have the baseline right now, but I think ultimately our end goal is we want kids to be successful on our power standards and learning targets. So if we're going through this process and we're collecting formative information on students and we're able to do the PLC work, the end outcome, the end goal should be we have a high percentage of students that are successful in all of our courses on our learning targets and power standards, which then we hope impacts some of those other assessments that our students take. But yes, I mean, I think you're right. We need to have some type of measurement that we can see, is this change made a positive difference with our work?
I agree with Rich. You guys know best on what the best research and best practices. There's lots of information out there. So if you guys are saying this is what we know to be best educational practice, I think that's on you guys to implement. But I also agree that we need to start looking at some of that data. So what is the baseline data? So if you're saying a third of the kids are not doing work? Is it a third of the kids all the time? A third of the kids are doing some of the work and not all of the work? And for you guys to look at which classes is that, which kids is it, how is that correlating to grades? I think that's important data for you guys to really know and understand, to know if this is impactful. And then if there is a way to measure, like, are we seeing an increase in work completion? And is that increase in work completion correlating with success in grades and whatever other measures? Like, we're doing lots of other internal assessments, right? So is that having a correlation with that?
Teresa, I'd agree. I mean, I think the reason it's hard to like compare what we did in the past to what we're going to be doing in the future is what we did in the past is
That's one of those kinds of things.
what we did in the past was trying to get kids to pass classes. To me, it's like a culture shift. Instead of teaching for grading or teaching for credits, it's teaching for learning now. And this last year and then next year is the first time that we've identified certain skills that we say kids absolutely must have. And we're gonna be measuring that, whether their attainment of skills. In the previous, we have a good graduation rate, right? But obviously that's not equating to a good achievement rate. Something's off there. We're getting kids through classes, but they're not necessarily learning the skills. So that's why we have to change to something. And I think the PLC process is right on with that and identifying those skills. And then start measuring the number of students who are meeting those skills at proficient levels. So that we can pull like DNF lists, we can pull GPAs within certain classes as a beginning measure, but it's gonna be a little bit different in the next year because we're gonna be measuring skills and power standards attained, if that makes sense. But I think we talked about that today. Those could be baseline measures for us. Measure how many kids were on the DNF list last year and years past, what the GPAs were in, let's say, bio or geometry, and what are they compared if we make this change? Because I would assume it would up the rigor, right? Kids on a whole would do better in the class because they're doing more practice, more work, and getting more formative feedback.
Likewise, in middle school, we have continued to track DF rates and would be able to see if this work is impacting those numbers. I think the build within Mastery Connect or the tracking formatives and summatives on power standards will give us a new data set to look at and see how process is being implemented and what impact that has. And so a lagging indicator on that would be our forward and ACT scores, but there's no doubt data that we could use for, we've had longitudinally that we would be able to present as a backdrop to this new variable, if you will, that we're introducing. Plus, we're capturing in a new way through the PLC and Mastery Connect data that's more specific to these, the learning targets and the power standards, if that makes sense.
It does. And I think it would be helpful to see, as you're measuring those throughout the year, at some point at a macro level, feedback to the board about how you're doing. Because I'm sure as you're implementing this, the measurements that you're going to set up, you'll have initial data and you'll roll throughout the year and you may have an indicator of how well it's working or not working. And that information may change the way that you're implementing. Maybe just not with this change, but any change that you guys are implementing for student achievement. And as a board, I think we'd like to see some of that information come back to us throughout the year instead of once a year. And I know that that'll be a topic of, I believe we're going to do a retreat on student achievement at some point here in the fall or winter and kind of flesh out what those items are and then how they're going to be measured and reported. So I think that all feeds into that.
We'll definitely have more robust information this year, Mastery Connect and attainment of those learning targets, and we can certainly bring like DNF lists and classroom GPAs and stuff that Mastery Connect haven't had before, so that'd be a nice addition. Instead of waiting for July.
Additional questions, comments? So before we move on, this is the first reading for, this is not just the grading change, but essentially a first reading for the high school handbooks, or is it just the assessments? This is just the assessment that's in here. So we'll attempt to approve
I don't
the
think we can-
handbook.
I don't think we can approve anything, because this is part of the handbook.
No, yeah, okay, so I know this isn't an approval, but we don't have the entire handbook in here, so usually we see them once and then we do an approval just so that we all understand in an effort to get the handbooks to the families in time, in a timely manner. We may review and approve the middle school and high school handbooks at the next board meeting. That's the intention, correct?
Correct. So the only change that we're currently looking at is in the grading area.
Okay,
So, and that's why we wanted to have this discussion to take questions and comments. And then as soon as the committee meets and everybody gets around it and they decide on what the language is gonna be, we'll provide that for the board for review and then bring it to the next meeting.
okay. So at the previous meeting, the handbooks were presented for both the buildings. We're not approving them at this meeting because there will be changes to the grading and assessment guidelines in the book, in the handbooks.
Correct.
So that language will come at the next meeting for approval. Everybody okay with that?
And this will affect both middle school and high school.
Yes.
Okay.
The grading and assessment guidelines originally were district guidelines.
I guess one more question, sorry. Depending on what the language is and the impact to what's been the standard practice for the last decade or so, what's our communication plan to parents and students look like? Good question.
We'll make sure that when we talk to the committee next week, we'll talk about how do we want to make sure we communicate out to parents and students, and that might be dependent on the changes that we make. And
Yeah, I mean, in several ways, we can do it ahead of time, we can do it, as soon as it's approved. I'm certainly gonna do it when I talk, when the kids come in, I talk to every single grade, and I talk at open house as well to parents. That doesn't catch everybody though, so we're gonna have to come up with a different forum to make sure to catch everybody
Who's on the committee? I mean, not particular names, but like,
A mix of teachers, administrators, DAC administrators, I don't remember exactly who was on it.
it's core, I mean, there's core teachers, there's encore teachers. It's a good mix of, I mean, it's all middle school and high school.
I thought you were talking about the previous committee that put this in place.
the grading, no, the grading.
The new one?
Yeah, right, yeah. So it's a mix of teachers from different levels, different subject areas. Like I said, core and encore is represented. And it's a group that's been, I think, on this committee for many, many years. And, I've had quite a few conversations in the past about standards-based grading and making some of those shifts. And then things have been paused a little bit over the last couple of years. But the group's been together a while and represents, I think, a lot of different areas across the two levels.
Okay, any additional questions or discussion? All right, thanks, guys. Moving on to item D, it's approval of the 22 through 23 school year high school activities handbook. This is a second reading for approval. Questions, discussion? Would anybody like to make a motion?
And we'll just be reminded, was there any significant changes?
So this, I believe there were no changes.
Yep. When we talked last month, too, they're redlined if there were, and I don't think there's any significant changes in the handbook. Or the activities.
Entertain a motion if somebody would like to make it.
I'll make a motion.
A second.
Motion by Eric, second by Teresa, to approve the 22-23 MHS Activities Handbook as presented. By voice vote, all those in favor signify by saying aye. All those opposed, nay. Motion carries. Next item is setting the 2022 annual meeting date. At our last annual meeting, we did not set a date by statute. It has to be, I think, from the 15th of May to the 31st of October, somewhere in that range, I think. So we were hanging on to setting that date for a variety of reasons, but now we also have a new district administrator, so I'd like to get your feedback on when you would like to see that happen and if you'd like to change the format of the meeting at all.
So, So obviously Ron, he does a lot of the stuff in the annual meeting. And we won't get our state information until after October 15th. So generally, I've tried it both ways where we've done the meeting early. I've done it in my previous district in June. And we do it based upon expected budget, because even if we do a meeting prior to October 15th, it's an estimate because we don't have our state numbers released yet. Then we'd have to do a levy certification after that in order, once we have our actual numbers and plug them in. So I would actually defer this to Ron when he would be the most comfortable to do it. Like I said, we'll get those numbers. I don't even know if the 15th is a Friday this year.
It's, 15th is a Saturday this
Saturday.
year, and so I'll just kind of give a little perspective. So last year, we tried to move it up a week so that it correlated with our normal October board meeting to basically save the board having a meeting that month. Had a few issues with that. Obviously, once we assumed we were going to have maybe a few attendees, we couldn't do, our normal start of the month presentations of our students, right? Because, we would have to figure out where we're having the meeting if we would have all the people who usually come for those recognitions plus an annual meeting crowd. I think the other thing that comes into play, especially this year with a November referendum, is we always have to act upon, the levy that was presented in the paper, and so we're working off of, some old numbers, even if the October 15th comes out. However, what we always were able to do prior to last year was on the night of the annual meeting, we could say, even though that is the case, this is what we're projecting the numbers to be next week when the board finalizes this levy. And with this year being a referendum year and with the state projecting a pretty significant aid increase for us, which would potentially significantly lower our levy, I think it would be nice to have the October 17th date so that we could get that information and tell people that as soon as possible. If we do it on the 10th, that information isn't going to be discussed or acted upon until the 24th. It's still going to come back and be acted upon on the 24th, but at least on the 17th, if we have the annual meeting that night, we could tell the people, these are what the numbers came out to be. This is what we're looking at doing next week, which gives us an extra week lead time as we're getting information out for the November referendum. So I would be in favor of the 17th personally. I know it's an extra meeting, but that's what we always had done for years. We tried it, didn't necessarily work for us great, so.
I do not have any reservations about the 17th of October as the annual meeting date. Does anybody else? Okay.
An emotion?
There isn't a motion in here.
Oh,
You guys should do a
We
motion
should
to
do a
set.
motion to set it, though, because it's usually a motion that's carried at the annual meeting. Okay.
so,
Yeah, so they did a motion that gave us latitude to set it at a later date, but you guys have to set it.
I'll make a motion to set the annual meeting date for October 17th, 2022.
One second.
A motion by Teresa and a second by Nikki. Additional discussion? By voice vote, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, nay. Motion carries. Next item is discussion and approval of the COVID protocols for 2022 through 2023. So we approve these on an annual basis, and the protocols from the previous school year have expired. Unfortunately, COVID has not expired yet. So we're going to have administration walk us through any changes to our existing protocols in preparation for the next school year.
So we met with our new school nurse, and Joe and Ron and I have all talked about what the recommendations would be. So Joe did prepare the document, the front-facing document for the students and parents, and Ron prepared the information for the staff. And I'm just gonna go ahead and hand that over to them.
Sure, I'll start. As Rich said, it's been nice to have a number of board meetings without the COVID discussion, but unfortunately it continues to be part of our reality. And so with FIG coming in, one of the things he wanted to do right away is get a handle on our plans going forward relative to COVID. And what I tried to do is create a document that captures our practice at the end of the year last year. I updated it with a few decisions that were made as we progressed through the end of the school year. As you'll remember, there were a couple of adjustments that we made relative to early childhood and 4K and some our masking decisions related to busing. So I tried to capture those within here. And there's some language changes that we adjusted and some numbers that were adjusted to give us a starting point relative to a conversation for how we're going to respond to COVID, giving everything that we currently know about the pandemic and where we're at. What I'm gonna do is not read the whole document to you because I'm assuming that's not what everyone's interested in, but instead try to hit some of the highlights, but I'd encourage anyone to please stop me and ask any questions if there's anything I missed or if it's unclear as I go through it. So please let me know. So just getting started with the plan. The structure remains very, very much the same as what we had last year. We kind of had the regular default plan. This is how we're going to practice related to COVID in our schools going forward. And then we would have the heightened COVID response plan that would be in place should there be a need to adjust our practice based on the numbers, and we'll get to that in a minute. In terms of masking, for the regular plan, the default plan, masking would be optional but strongly recommended for all students in grades 4K through 12. Again, that was an adjustment that was made towards the end of the school year relative to our youngest learners. In terms of bus requirements, the federal requirement for masking on a bus is no longer in place. And so our practice has been that our masking practices on our buses would mirror what we're doing in the schools. Therefore that makes it pretty clear and easy for us to follow and really allows us to effectively communicate with lamers and the staff to make sure that that we're following the procedures correctly. The district will identify individuals that test positive for COVID, but we're gonna do that through a notice of exposure. We're not going to use contact tracing as we did through most of last year, and you all remember that discussion. We talked about it quite a bit. There were a couple reasons for that. Number one is that once the county stopped conducting contact tracing, the feeling with many citizens in the community was that it was no longer necessary, and it resulted in a lot of less than pleasant conversations between our nursing staff and our community, not to mention the incredible amount of time and resources it took to conduct that. And given what we knew about the progression of COVID and the particular variant of that time, we were usually 2 to 3 days behind everything that was going on. So they felt as though while they were still doing the work, it wasn't yielding the results that we truly wanted to keep our kids and our staff safe. So for those reasons, we're not going to recommend that contact tracing be in place at this time. We will use the notice of exposure. We will identify students and staff that test positive for COVID. If they're determined to be in school during their infectious period, the district will identify those that may potentially have been exposed. Families will receive emails notifying them of potential exposure, and we will offer voluntary COVID testing moving forward. As far as quarantines, again, I'm not going to read all the language. The calendar days, that was just a clarification regarding the language that FIG pointed out that I thought was good, making sure that we recognize that it's 10 calendar days, not 10 school days. We would continue to offer a test to stay program, and participation in the program requires a mask through or for the 10 days, calendar days from the onset of symptoms. Again, there's a couple of those adjustments of being very clear about 10 calendar days. One piece of language that we built in that FIG offered, which I thought was good, was that those that refuse the test will be presumed positive. That was really our practice last year, but we didn't have that explicitly stated. So I thought it was good that they pointed that out, and to make that clear that if you do refuse to test, you'll be subject to quarantine as identified. So I'm gonna stop there and ask if there are any questions relative to that regular COVID plan, as I just very quickly went through it.
Test to stay for close contacts. We're not identifying close contacts because we're working through a notice of exposure. So if the county identifies their close contacts based on a COVID positive, say inside of a family
Yep,
unit or a home, then test to stay.
household contacts and those as identified by the county. Which, again, unsure as to where the county's gonna be in terms of their practice and how they'll handle it going forward. I know that's one of the things that FIG talked about, is desire to have some communication with the county so we could get a sense of what their plan is going forward. But at this point, that's how we would use the test to stay program. And I think one of the things that we were very fortunate to be able to do was offer tests to those that had some concerns as they arose. So whether it be someone that was at a family picnic over the weekend and became aware of someone that was positive, we were able to offer testing for those that volunteered for that practice. And that was largely through the generosity of Colony Brands and donating a number of tests that put us in a good position relative to our inventory. Great, good question, Rich. Any others? And again, I recognize I went through it pretty quickly, but I know you all spent more than your fair share of time going through this discussion last year. Hearing none, I'll jump to the heightened COVID response plan. The biggest change that you'll see is an adjustment to the numbers that we have listed for what initiates the HCRP. As you'll remember, to roll into or to go into the heightened COVID response plan, we use a 3-day rolling average for student COVID positive cases. When FIG came in and asked about our structure, my personal opinion was that served us well. If you all remember January of last school year, it was a bit of an adventure. The board had just made a decision in December. We came back from the holiday break and quickly realized that things were gonna get a bit hairy. By January 13th, we had to activate the HCRP, and I believe the following day on the 14th was our highest case count at 103. And then if you remember, we saw a pretty quick decline in the numbers, and whether that's due to the HCRP being implemented and being fairly effective, or it was the natural progression of the variant of the time, it worked quite well, and before the end of the month, we were out of this plan. And I think people were even those that weren't particularly fond of the masking mandate, I think they felt that the district were true to their word, and we followed through on the numbers, and we monitored, and we were transparent with the data. And as soon as we hit the mark as established in this plan, we were out. And I know I personally received a number of phone calls and emails, at least acknowledging and thanking us for following through on what we said we were gonna do. So for those reasons, I felt good about this structure. In talking with FIG, there was some discussion about where we're at and the evolution of COVID response in the schools, and whether or not, as you can see previously, we had 50 for the 3-day rolling average to trigger the HCRP, and whether or not that should be a larger number. 100 has been inserted as a starting point in a conversation for the board to discuss whether or not that's appropriate, and FIG will discuss some of that with you. And then accordingly adjusted the second piece of that, which is rolling out of the HCRP, which again, we used the 2-week rolling average for that. That was established at 80 to make it align with the 100 number that was offered above. Other than that, much of it is very much the same. Mask would be mandatory, and if we were to go to the heightened response plan, most of it's just language clarification relative to the 10 calendar days and those that refused testing would be presumed positive and subject to quarantine. We did include some of the information related to athletics. As you all remember, that was something that we had to address last year. While that was difficult to monitor and police, I wanted to roll some of that forward for the board's consideration. And then we listed the symptoms, and much of what we've known about COVID remains to be true with the B4 and B5 variants. It's not manifesting in a way that's significantly different. And so those recommendations continue to be the same. So with that, I will stop and open it up to any questions or comments that you all may have at this time.
For the HCRP, you went from 50 to 100, and then you said that the 80, you went from 35 to 80. Was it just to be doubled? Or why was the threshold raised?
Yeah, you're looking at me like you want to talk, or do you want me?
So it's based on a percentage. So it was based on roughly 2% last year. So this takes the percentage up to 4%. So that's about where those numbers are coming in. And then the numbers just based on the fact that, our world is pretty much functioning where if people are ill, they stay home. And that's what we're gonna have to press with the communications also. If people are sick, stay home till they know it's not COVID. But, so the simple answer is it was a percentage, and we wanted to be able to increase that percentage based on the world we're living in right now, not the world we were living in 6 months ago. Did that answer your question? Is that Eric?
I understand, the math seems weird, but I don't want to argue about it anymore, so that's fine.
No, Eric, to your point, when Fig, brought this in and we had the conversation, he asked me what I thought, and I said, I like our plan. I think it's good. It worked, right? And I think the point is that as we're moving forward, we know that this is going to be a part of our reality. And the question becomes, do we start making adjustments to help us move from treating COVID as a pandemic, which it currently is identified as, and do we start moving towards something that allows us to respond in a way that's going to probably be more along the lines of how we respond to other illness in schools, such as the flu, which we do have some experience with a significant number of flu cases in schools and having to respond accordingly. So I think your question is a good one. It's not a surprise. I anticipated it, so.
So I guess the point would be then, if it's still a pandemic, is it up to us to decide that it's not a pandemic anymore or an endemic? Or?
Yeah, I think that's a question for the board to discuss, right? I think ultimately what we wanted to do is provide a starting point for a conversation, knowing that there'd be varying opinions related to that question on the board. But it's one that I think the board needs to feel comfortable with the decision as we prepare to communicate going forward into the next school year.
I'm comfortable with your decision.
Couldn't hear you, Cheryl. What was it?
I'm comfortable with trying this new number. I'm comfortable with the decision.
What'd you say?
She said she's comfortable trying the new number. Any other comments or discussion?
I'm good with increasing the numbers. I think we're in a different place perhaps than we were a year ago. And I would support it. I would support the policy as it is with the changes incorporated.
I would agree. I'm okay with this as it's presented. I know that COVID is very different, but I still go back and reflect to nearly 2.5, 3 years ago when we were at almost 30% threshold and we weren't closing the school. We said we'd hit 30% and then we'd shut it down. So I think that at some point we have to slowly climb out of this, and I think increasing this to 4%, I don't think we're throwing all caution to the wind. I think we're moving the needle slowly and responsibly, and I'm okay with this.
So I think you meant 30 cases instead of percent.
No, I mean before
We
COVID hit. before COVID hit.
Oh, for a
That
flu
February,
percentage.
yes, for a
Yes,
flu percentage,
gotcha.
we were saying, oh my gosh, we haven't hit 30% yet, we're not closing the district. And so
Right.
I think we're a far cry from 30% out. But I think it's time to start moving it so that we can try to get back to business as usual, responsibly and carefully.
So the one thing, and Joe and I talked about this also, is we have an overall number here in the implementation, but I think it would be wise to use that percentage, find those numbers per building. So, because every building may not have a high case number. So it wouldn't make sense if there's an outbreak in one elementary school to mask all the elementary schools. You know, so the number is still pretty low. Same thing at the high school and the middle school. So are we gonna make every building mask because we have potentially an outbreak at a different school? So that would be something that we had talked about, and that would be a board thing, but that would be something we'd put, is we'd set the threshold up per building, so it's not everybody that might have to mask. I know in my previous district, we did it by building, and one building was definitely masked more often than the other, and the other only had to mask at one time because of it. And if we would've had it the other way, they'd have been masked a lot more than they probably needed to be. So.
I think that the policy was written in such a way that it gives you the latitude to adjust it by building. And it empowers you to make those decisions. One of the items that we added was the ability for the Board of Education Executive Committee to make changes. We likely could strike that. That was placed as a safeguard for when Rick was on leave.
Oh, right.
So
That's a good call.
I think that we can pull that back out again. This policy would then provide you with the delegated authority to make changes to the protocols as you deem fit. And the reality of that could be, staffing a building could push you towards making decisions just to keep a building open. You need to have the ability to make those decisions, right? What's odd about this is that you have the delegated authority to do that today outside of a COVID world. Like if you need to close a building, you can. But because we're encompassing our response to COVID-19 in this protocols document, that's why that's called out, so.
Could we also
I
then,
agree.
Rich, strike the special board meeting and just, he has the power until we have the next board
Until the
meeting?
next regular board meeting, yep. So the special board meeting was put in there because if the executive committee made a decision, say like the day after a board meeting, we wanted to ratify it by a special board meeting. So,
So we probably could strike that as well.
Makes sense. I agree with that. That makes sense.
Cindy, do you got that?
Joe is getting it, I see.
I'm in the document striking those areas, and we will make those adjustments. So thanks for asking that question. I was going to ask the same thing, Nikki. Appreciate it.
beyond the thresholds, I'm okay with us aligning to notice of exposure instead of contact tracing and calling it out inside the document. That then aligns us with the county's protocols. I am okay with trying to hire case numbers. And I trust that Figgy will adjust those if you need to. If we get into some kind of an outbreak and we're unable to run a building or it is causing significant health impacts to students or staff, that you'll adjust that if you need to, so.
Yeah, there'll be plenty of conversation around it for sure. You bet. Yep.
You know, you made a good point, Rich, and I hadn't really reflected and gone that far back, but I think initially in FIG, you may or may not be aware of this, but originally I think the plan was that the board empowered the superintendent at the time to make a lot of these decisions based on a lot of different data points and information that was coming his way. And so I think these changes are reflecting moving it back towards that direction, given that we have a superintendent in place. So
You know, and I'm, honestly, I'm fine with that because that's how we did it previously also. It makes us more nimble and we can respond quicker.
Yeah.
Any additional questions or discussion on the proposed COVID protocols for the 22 through 23 school year?
I just want to say that I think it's a great call out to have it per school instead of across the district. Because I think that limits down to school and even classroom. Because last year we were seeing certain classrooms that maybe had higher numbers, but then that would probably be more of a grade level. Did we ever just close or mask a certain grade at once?
I don't think we were
No.
that
Kids are
surgical
just,
with
I
it.
mean,
We did by classroom, and in some cases, there's only a couple of classrooms for a grade, so you may have.
I think I'm getting confused
Effectively
with maybe a different
wound up
school
with that.
district that I heard a lot about.
You got a staff member living in the house.
I do.
All right.
So you
Anything
need a
else?
motion?
Yep, if somebody would like to make it as it's written here.
I'll make it to approve the COVID protocols for the 22-23 school year as presented by administration with the amendments we've made this evening. Is that okay to say?
Second.
Motion by Nikki and a second by Phil. Additional discussion or questions? Hearing none by voice vote, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, nay. Motion carries. Next item is the COVID handbook supplement. Is that one over to Ron or?
Yep.
Yeah, so we actually edited that down last year quite a bit, so it was much shorter, and materially, there's not a lot of changes, even though there's, some significant red and blue on your sheet there. In the quarantines area, at the start of last year, we listed what our language was, and I had actually originally pared it down to just the two sentences that say, we're gonna follow whatever our current plans are, and the plans change throughout the year, because that's the reality, right? Fig did suggest that we just summarize a little bit what our start of the year situation is, so I did capture that, where we quarantine for 10 days, however, there is a test to stay where you can come back sooner if you participate in that, and that if you are the household person, you have to quarantine much like as if you were a positive person. So that's really no change in the sense of what we're doing, only that our quarantine criteria changed from the start of last year to the start of this year, and as we know, will change potentially throughout the year. Section B, that probably was a miss last year. We really eliminated last year differentiating work-based COVID-19 cases from non-work-based, because as the world opened up, you really can't tell, right? And so just eliminating the reference to the non-work related. And then as the year went on and people got used to this 70-30 rule, we didn't have everybody doing a check with Ron, right? They just knew enough to put it in, and that's what we did. We discussed this, and we felt that we're still in a COVID world. We still would like to have the regular teachers participate as much as they're able to, if they're out on a quarantine or if they're ill but able to work. And so we're going to continue doing that. And probably the one area where we had some issues the last year or two was probably more in the home or care side of the world, right? Where, maybe the staff member or their child was positive, and about the time that ended for either one or the other, then either their child or themselves would become positive, and suddenly 10 days became 20 days, and then about the time that ended, their daycare shut down because it had gotten into their daycare. And so we discussed whether we wanted to do that or continue that, but the reality is people don't have a lot of control over COVID. We know that daycare is an issue. We're gonna encourage them to come up with alternative plans, so that's not their first choice, is just to utilize this, but understand for some families that they may have to utilize this for some of those situations. So not a real change from last year, but just that was some of our thought and reasoning behind it. And everything else remains the same. I mean, I think we hope we don't have to shut down sports again. We only really did that in that first spring of 2020, but it doesn't hurt us to leave the language in there. as always, we know that we do have some at-risk employees, and so if they need some PPE or accommodations, we're always willing to work with them. And the other thing we implemented with COVID was, it used to be at 5 days, if you were over 5 unpaid days, we started prorating your benefits differently, right? And so, we've upped that to 10, and it doesn't come into play much with that 70-30 provision in there. So, there's some protection there for people, they don't hit that number, but we do understand that there may be a higher number for some unpaid leaves just because of the COVID, so. No real changes other than really just, summarizing what our new quarantine rules are and saying they're gonna change potentially throughout the year.
Questions, discussion? Looking for motion if somebody would. Yes, like to make it.
I'll make a motion.
I'll second.
Motion by Eric, second by Teresa. Additional discussion or questions? Hearing none, by voice vote, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, nay. Motion carries. Next item is an informational item regarding an additional high school girls tennis assistant.
So this was, this was added due to an increase in participation. And I believe this is something that Monroe would normally do. It's in the best interest of the student athletes that are out. So that's why we have the recommendation before you. So I believe the number they have, is it 35 to 38, is that?
Right, yeah. And with how some people in tennis know that we can't do them all at high school, so they're kind of around town. So it's a safety issue too, they really need. Not only coaching, but supervision around town.
Great news for that program.
It's awesome.
No kidding.
So, no,
Just 4 or 5 years it went from single digits to this, right?
Yeah, kudos to Matt Gordner and the coaches, because they're learning the game at that point.
Yeah, I don't know if it was boys or girls, one of them got down to having a single coach, right? And we were wondering whether we're gonna continue it. And we didn't even have language for if tennis numbers ever got high enough to require a third, we do for like softball and baseball, right? And so, yeah, this is great.
We talk about coaches and relationships with kids, the 3 coaches they'll have now are all 3 amazing at that, so it's not gonna drop off at all. I would expect it gets higher.
Did we have 3 ever in the past or not?
Not that I know of,
No.
I'm not sure.
You have coaches, I think we had a staff member that was volunteering and providing help, right? Melissa was, I think, in the mix helping out at times, so.
I don't remember in the past that we had like 3 day coaches.
So we already have this person identified too? Awesome.
Okay, great. Any additional questions from the board? This one's informational. All right. Moving on to section 8, our informational items, boardsmanship. So we're going to discuss some dates for our training sessions. What do you have in mind there?
Honestly, I would prefer that we call them workshops. So,
Okay.
yep.
All right, for our workshops.
For our workshops, yeah. So, so we did get some dates proposed, and attached is the proposed training. And, the total comes out to, I think, like $2,850 for the sessions. They come, they're done in person, and they're laid out within those topics. They are workshops, they are board workshops, they are open meetings. If people choose to come in and watch or observe the meeting, they may do that. It's not done in closed session. These are things, Dan Nerad is gonna be the presenter. And he was the district administrator at Green Bay School District. He was in Green Bay for about 30 plus years, their administrator for 7. So he was in Madison for 4 years, right around Act 10. He was in Michigan, and now he's with the WASB. So he's got a ton of experience. So the dates that he wanted us to check, he has a commitment, he has something out to a school, I did not hear from him today, but August 9th or 11th. And it's gonna be one of those days, and unfortunately, I can't tell you which one it is because he didn't get back to me today, because he had another school looking. That's one potential date. The other dates would be August 15th, the 22nd, the 23rd, and the 24th.
And we need to get a total of 3 that work for all.
Correct.
And these are how long?
90 minutes.
90 minutes.
But like morning or afternoon or evening, or is all the above?
So he can come anytime on those days.
So I think evening probably makes the most sense. Start times could be as early as 5, if that works for everybody.
You would do all 3 sections then, in other words.
One per night,
3 days.
Yeah,
so 3 days.
So the 22nd is our regular scheduled board meeting for August also.
So do we think that we could do this, say at a 5 PM on a regular board meeting evening, or do we want to go for days that are separate from board meetings?
I would prefer to piggyback.
That would be one of them at least, yeah.
I would too.
Okay, so the 22nd looks like one.
I'm not available that day,
You're not available at all on
but
that day?
22nd.
Okay.
Yeah.
You can take her now.
So would this be, I know it would be ideal to get a date right now with everybody sitting here, but is this something where it'd be easier if each of you got back to me with the dates that work for you, or we get out,
Would you
Yeah,
put
Let-
it
let's
get
do
out
it
a
as a
doodle,
poll.
get out a
Do it as a
doodle?
poll.
and
Yeah.
Yeah.
Especially if there's three sessions with 5 possible days, it'll be
Right.
faster if we just do it as a
Yeah.
poll.
Yep, yep. And the, and he said, we basically can pick what we want to do. So, the last session they do that they're offering is, what are the commitments, for the board, for the superintendent? What kind of commitments are we making to each other about how we're gonna serve children?
Okay. Great.
So just a clarification question, because how is this different than a board retreat that isn't for the world to watch?
So,
Not that I care, I'm just asking.
yeah, so this is the Wisconsin Association of School Boards, and they have prescribed workshop topics. They bring in and they facilitate discussion to address the things that are on here about the relationships, governance, communications, things like that. So,
I'm just asking the public versus private, like,
Even
a
if we,
board retreat we can do privately, right? Or no?
no, it's an open meeting,
Open
so
meeting.
board
Oh, it's just nobody
retreat
came
still,
when we did
right,
it.
exactly. So it has to be posted,
That's
it's an
fine.
open meeting, and if for some reason
missed
we
that
have
part.
business to conduct in a closed session, then
Got it.
it's, the retreat is structured like a meeting too, so we,
Got it.
do the whole
Okay.
thing.
Just nobody came.
Just nobody came,
Okay, perfect. I thought there was a difference.
no, that's a valid question. That's good.
absolutely. Okay, we'll watch for that.
Okay.
That's all I had on boardsmanship. Anything from administration?
We may at some point do a doodle poll as well. We might wait till you guys figure those dates out first. And then, we were still trying to get up to Wisconsin Dells to see, a new high school up there and potentially tie in, Baraboo or one of the other newer districts, buildings that are on the way. So maybe do 2 on a day. And so I just know a couple of the days that I had originally talked about were a couple of days that those are. And so I'm guessing you're not gonna wanna travel all day and then have a meeting that night.
They do it on the bus.
But we will send out a doodle poll probably after we know those days, and then you can select that alternatively afterwards.
Thank you, Ron. I do not have any board correspondence at this time. Committee reports, anything from you, Eric?
Nope.
Dylan?
Nope.
Terry?
No.
Nikki?
Nope.
Teresa?
No,
Phil?
No.
Cheryl? Agenda items for future discussion from any board members? Liaison reports, Amir Mass. 5 minutes for the press. And now item 10 will be a closed session, so we'd be looking to go into closed closed session according to Wisconsin statutes 19.85, paren 1,
Thanks, guys.
paren E, and paren C. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, guys.
For the purpose of discussing the purchase of property, the district administrator's evaluation, and the administrative goals for the 22-23 school year and compensation study. Entertain a motion.
So moved.
A motion by Teresa and a second by Nikki. This is a roll call vote, and we do not have business in open afterwards. So, we call the roll, please.
Yep. Nikki Austin, yes. Rich Deprey.
Yes.
Eric Ekdahl.
Yes.
Terry Ellison.
Yes.
Teresa Keen.
Yes.
Cheryl McGuire. Dylan McGuire.
Yes.
Phil Vosberg. Tim Wolf is absent.
All right,
We're in
we'll go into close